February 21st, 2025. This is André Fauteux of La Maison du 21e siècle, 21st Century Housing Magazine based in Quebec. And today I'm very, very happy to have Dr. Beatrice Golomb with me today. Is that how we pronounce it?
Good enough. Beatrice Golomb is how I pronounce it, but names are individual.
Okay, great, Golomb. So uh, last week on CBC television, the French TV, we had a show on the Havana Syndrome. The original version made in France, the English title is called America Under Threat, and it's distributed. The video, people can buy it from Arte, Arte distribution. So we got an adapted version here in Quebec. And I was really struck. I know you wrote about Havana Syndrome. In a few minutes, we'll talk about your paper. You were notably a speaker at the EMF conference, which is with the 2021 version. And I'm very happy to say that the organizers, Libby Kelly, made all those talks available via Vimeo so people can access your talk on page 2. And I listened also this week to a great interview you did with Theodora Scarrato of the Environmental Health Trust. But just to start, I want to talk about Adam, who was a spy with the CIA, I believe, and a former police officer in Maine, who got really sick in Havana, and he mentions in this documentary where you're interviewed also by the French producers and movie makers that he was a week away from committing suicide. He had decided to commit suicide. And a week later, or a few days later, he was helped out. There was it Susan Collins, I think, the senator who got a bill adopted to recognize Havana Syndrome and get those people treated. So we're going to talk about what's Havana Syndrome and how it relates to electrosensitivity. Uh, just before that, the last thing I want to mention is the Cell Phone Task Force.org website by Arthur Furstenberg, who's the author of a history, a great book about the invisible rainbow, history of electrosensitivity. On his website, he mentions that during the 1950s, clinics were established in Moscow, Leningrad, and other cities in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to study and treat thousands of workers suffering from a new occupational disease in the 1950s. It was named radio wave sickness. These patients manufactured, inspected, repaired, or operated microwave equipment. So I invite people to go see that. And so this was something well known even during the Second World War. And I'd like to, what I read was that the Americans didn't take what the Russians were publishing very seriously until some of their own people became sick. And can you tell us a bit about the Moscow signal briefly, please?
Yeah, so uh, U.S. diplomatic personnel that were stationed in Moscow in the late 1950s and early 1960s um, were subjected to radio frequency radiation in the, I guess, microwave range, initially from a building next door to the embassy and then from one across from it. And people reported health problems. A study was commissioned from Johns Hopkins University, the Lilienfeld study, which was actually never underwent peer-reviewed publication. Um, what it did was it looked at people that were in the Moscow embassy, and it compared them in two different ways to other groups. It compared them to others stationed in other Eastern European embassies, which unfortunately are the other embassies where there could have been radiation. And in fact, other diplomats posted in others of those embassies sent back data showing that microwave exposure had occurred in at least some of them. But what it did is it looked at the standardized mortality and morbidity ratios compared to the overall U.S. population.
Mhm.
And there's a phenomenon that we very well know called the healthy worker effect.
Yeah.
We do a lot of work on Gulf War veterans, and it's called the healthy warrior effect. The people that are selected for the military, they select out people with past health problems.
Mhm.
So even for people who are, deployed and exposed to, terrible circumstances, they often have lower rates across the board of many health problems than others. And similarly, people that are selected to serve in high threat areas as foreign services personnel, they're not going to take the people with pre-existing severe diabetes, chronic infectious disease, et cetera. So it was acknowledged in this Johns Hopkins study that there was a major healthy worker effect, and these people had lower levels of most health conditions and most symptoms than the general U.S. population. But interestingly, the few signals, the few things that showed a standardized mortality or morbidity ratio greater than 1, meaning that the level was higher in the Moscow group compared to the other group, were all in the category of things that we now recognize as involved in effective radio frequency illness. So sleep problems, cognitive problems. I think there were several cancers, including brain cancers. There were a few different slices that they took of those data. They looked at offspring as well as looking at the personnel themselves. I remember they didn't have anything like tinnitus was not one of the symptoms looked at, but ear problems, which would presumably encompass things like tinnitus, was one of the things that was elevated. So the few signals, the few symptoms that showed a point estimate greater than 1 instead of everything else was less than 1 were all sort of fits with what we would anticipate would be involved. The study had a number of other problems. It had a very low uptake rate. So epidemiological studies are considered to be good if 70% or more of the desired individuals participate in here. I think it was something like 29%. And also they had been back stateside often for many years. And we know that especially in the older days when people were not routinely exposed to all of these sources, people would recover when they were away from the source to varying degrees, not always completely. And in fact, I would argue that these data underscore that it's not always completely. But despite all those things, there were those slight signals. So there were other things that are known about the microwave exposures at that time. There was a carving of the Great Seal given by Russian school children to the then U.S. ambassador to Moscow, who kept it in his office. Later, it was discovered that in it was hidden a microwave-activated listening device. I spoke with Sherry Thompson, who was the daughter of Llewellyn Thompson, who had been an ambassador in Russia. She had lived in the ambassador's house in the early 1960s. She mentioned that after a heavy rain, a roof had collapsed in one of the bathrooms, and a number of what were believed to be microwave-activated listening devices had fallen through the ceiling. And she and her sister, they were small children at the time, had giggled about the poor people that had to listen to bathroom noises. But interestingly, I later read in a novel by somebody who had been a politician, I think in both the House of Lords and the House of Commons in England, that it was mentioned that bathrooms are often places where people will go to have private conversations with the idea that they can turn on the tap, and that if there is a listening device, the assumption is that others won't be able to hear them. So that may be a reason to prioritize the bathroom as a place for listening. So
it's funny
I know that
let me tell you, when I was 18, I had a girlfriend whose family was friends with a former ambassador in Moscow, Canadian ambassador. And the day when they walked into their new home, his wife said she didn't like the curtains. And the next day, the Russians came in to change the curtains.
Yes.
So it was weird. They were telling them, we're bugging you.
That's right. Yes, it was also a message. Yes. Yeah. So interestingly, the levels of radiation that were measured at that time were above the legal Russian limits, but within the allowable U.S. limits. So
Yeah,
the
but how
Russian
much?
allowable limits for radio frequency radiation were, if recollection is correct, I think 1,000 times lower than the allowable U.S. limits. And I've had a number of hypotheses about why they may have been in a better position to recognize problems with radio frequency radiation. There's abundant evidence that it is mediated, the damage is mediated substantially by what's called oxidative stress, which is the type of free radical injury that antioxidants help protect against, the kind of antioxidants that both your body makes, and different people have different gene variants that can make them more or less vulnerable to oxidative stress, and that also you can get from, fruits, vegetables, and so forth. And I visited the Soviet Union as a child in 1976 when it was still under Soviet control. My father had written a book that had been translated into Russian, and his pretext for going was that the only way he could get royalties is if he went there, and he was only allowed to get the royalties in Russian currency, which he couldn't convert to US dollars.
Okay.
And there wasn't really anything that you would want to buy in Russian currency. But one of the things that really struck me when we were there is that basically the food was bread. And in the 2 weeks that we were in the Soviet Union, I once saw something in the fruit or vegetable category. My father was invited to an event as a guest from the National Academy of Engineering by the Russian Academy, I guess, of Sciences. And so they put out a big spread, and at this, grand fete, they had a bowl of apples that had been buried and then dug back up. So fruit was so scarce there that the antioxidant defenses that people would normally be able to, support by dietary practices seemed to be negligible. And so I have no idea if that's legitimately a reason why they were better positioned to recognize the problem, that perhaps many more of their people had the problem. But what we do know is it's certainly the case that there was a naval report originally in 1971 by Glaser, who updated it multiple times in the 1970s, that identified, I think by the 1972 version, there were something like 3,400 or 3,600 citations on biological and health effects of radio frequency radiation. A large plurality of those were from Russia and Eastern Europe. There had been much more attention paid to that issue in Russia and Eastern Europe than in the U.S. And if you look at, there are a number of U.S. military documents that came out as well, starting with a naval report in, I think it was 1932. And then we had reports from the Air Force and NASA and Army. And one of them actually had the title, I think, biological effects of radio frequency / microwave radiation. And it had a quote in there basically saying, and I normally I keep the quote handy, but I should have prepped to have it ready before this interview, but didn't. But basically acknowledging that there are major biological effects of radio frequency radiation. And there was a Defense Intelligence Agency report as well. That may have been the report. I'd have to go back and look up among these U.S., government reports that basically said, well, yeah, maybe we should have stricter standards, but that would put us at a competitive disadvantage because Russia may have the standards, but they'll violate them. So we'll be at a military and commercial disadvantage if we tighten our standards. And so I think that was, part of the thinking. And then, over time, between tech and big data and big telecom, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry that really doesn't want any restrictions on exposure. And, once that came to pass, once cell phones and cell towers and smart meters and everything else, came to be in use, the behemoth that would oppose any serious study just became pretty much too big to withstand. And this resulted in a number of adverse factors, like in the United States, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I'm always blocking between a different act for a different topic. So I can never remember if it's 94 or 96 because the other one's either 84 or 86. But the U.S. Telecommunications Act, in which the 15 congressional staffers that helped industry write the bill, of those 15, 13 went on to become lobbyists for the telecom industry. And so that in the United States had a statement in there saying that environmental effects cannot be considered in citing in approvals for cell towers, and this was construed as extending to to human health effects. And so that has been like the biggest obstacle to people getting any kind of ability to protect human health, even when people are suffering health effects because there are, massive cell towers put up near them, et cetera. So that Telecommunications Act, which was heavily industry influenced, and there's an excellent Harvard Software Ethics Center report by Norm Alster entitled Captured Agency that talks not only about how those 13 of the 15 congressional staffers, went on to become lobbyists, but about all the other, the massive capture of the agency that is intended to regulate this industry is basically acting on behalf of the industry, with successive heads, for example, of the FCC having been head of the two top lobbying firms for the industry, the top lawyer for Verizon, et cetera. So I'm not anti-industry, but I am pro-human health. I'm a physician and deal with a lot of people that have had adverse consequences from a number of different environmental exposures that often operate through the twin intertwined activities of oxidative stress and impairment of the mitochondria, which are the energy powerhouses of cells, and radiofrequency radiation, and especially pulsed radiofrequency radiation and modulated radiofrequency radiation is one of those things.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you, well, you mentioned the revolving door effect that we've seen even with chemical pollutants. It's very often
absolutely
like civil servants used to be the lobbyists. Yeah. So how did you get interested in the health effects of electromagnetic fields? When did you discover it?
Well, it happened a little bit gradually. I've been doing work on illness in Gulf War veterans, and both in the U.S. especially, but also in Canada and France and and England and Denmark and other countries, but overwhelmingly dominantly the United States. In the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, personnel were sent after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait to the Persian Gulf Theater of Operations. And the U.S. sent about 700,000 people. The next largest troop force was Saudi Arabia. We have basically no health data from there. That was 150,000. And then I think England had, on the order of 44 to 50,000. Australia had some, Canada had some, but really comparatively small numbers. So a lot of the research has come out of the U.S., although a moderate amount has come out of England and some has come out of Australia, and I think one thing from Canada, the Goss-Gilroy report. But about a third of the people that were deployed to that conflict, even though the ground war only lasted 4 days, and many of those that were deployed never saw combat, but a third of them developed illness, chronic multi-symptom illness, that is clearly now, by subsequent evidence, causally tied to the they experienced, and so we've been interested in Gulf War illness since the 1990s. So for that conflict, there was an unprecedented number of new, unique, and excessive chemical exposures. Everything from the fact that we gave about 250,000 of the troops a pill called pyridostigmine bromide that was intended to protect them in the event of nerve gas attack, although a report I did for the think tank RAND showed that rather than protecting them, the evidence suggested that it would both worsen health effects and also mission completion, which is, of course, what they care about in the military, with the possible exception of one nerve gas for which there had been no suggestion of intelligence on the battlefield there. And I won't go into the complicated reasons why that one might have been an exception. And the U.S. did change their military policy regarding use of that thereafter. And in fact, a study that came out just last year overwhelmingly supported my conclusion, showing that the people that developed health effects apparently tied to low-level exposure to serum nerve gas, those who heard chemical alarms and became ill, became selectively ill if they had the gene variant that was bad at detoxifying serum nerve gas, but that in turn occurred selectively in the group that had the PB exposure. So it was the group that had this, quote, protective agent that selectively actually had the problems with nerve gas exposure. So anyway, there are multiple, pesticide and also pesticide exposure also in the organophosphate and carbamate category. Those are classes of chemicals that are what are called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, as was the nerve gas pretreatment pill. And pesticide exposed also became ill, and that was also selectively in the people that had the PB exposure. So anyway, it was in Gulf War veterans that I first, a lot of them became chemically sensitive, and a physician that was caring for them first talked about electrical sensitivity. That's the first time I ever heard about electrical sensitivity as an issue, was in veterans with Gulf War illness. It's not a common problem in that group. As in other groups, it's typically a subset of those with multiple chemical sensitivity. We actually have an article under review right now in Gulf War veterans looking at multiple chemical sensitivity, which again, like high overlap with electrical sensitivity, that supports a previous Japanese study showing that in Gulf War veterans, chemical sensitivity is tied to variants in a gene that's involved in production of what's considered the most important mitochondrial antioxidant. So again, it supports the idea of mitochondrial antioxidation regulation being involved in occurrence or protection from chemical sensitivity. And again, electrosensitivity has high overlap, and there are some people that are electrically sensitive and not chemically sensitive, but a lot of electrically sensitive people were chemically sensitive first after a chemical exposure. So that's when I first became interested. And then, we did a survey study in maybe 2012 to 2014 time period of people that reported electrical sensitivity. I had some family, crises culminating in the deaths of a parent that kind of interrupted my work when we probably would have normally submitted that for publication. It's actually never been submitted, but we surveyed a few over 200 people with electrosensitivity, and then a group of healthy controls, and inquired about a lot of precursor factors. We also, what is the most, was there a triggering factor that they attribute, before this happened, they didn't have chemical sensitivity, and after they did. And for about 69% of people, there was a recognized triggering factor. And the overwhelming most common triggering factor was smart meters, which involve pulsed radiofrequency radiation. And the guidelines for exposure look at averages over time, and the pulses can be 1 billion times more intense than the averages. If you have a nanosecond pulse, and if you have one in a second, then basically the pulse intensity, is 1 billion times as strong as the 1 second average. And so, we do, averages of intensity over 6 minutes or 30 minutes, and then, over a block of tissue, there can be much, much stronger exposures in a smaller time and a smaller space. And we know that actually pulsed electromagnetic radiation is used to treat cancer by causing, quote, irreversible electroporation, including supposedly non-ionizing pulsed radiofrequency radiation. So it's actually used for the purpose of killing cells in some settings, and yet the claim from industry has been it can't have any biological effects except by heating, even though, that was supposed to be non-thermal. And somebody keeps trying to call me. I'm just going to interrupt this to get them off the line. Sorry about that. We're working with the group that had the chemical exposure in East Palestine, Ohio, who are a lot of them are very sick right now. So it was somebody from there trying to call. But anyway, so that's when I first heard about electrical sensitivity and when we first started getting involved. And we also found that consistent with our expectation, people with any of a set of past exposures or conditions tied to mitochondrial impairment and oxidative stress had much higher prevalence. Or let me put it the other way, the electrosensitive people had much higher prevalence of conditions and exposures that are tied to mitochondrial impairment and oxidative stress. And one of the most interesting findings from that survey was we reasoned that since a lot of electrosensitive people note that they have a stepped process where maybe there's some exposure that makes them a little bit electrosensitive,
Mhm.
and then they may go on at that level for a while, and then they have another significant exposure
Yeah.
that affects them, that steps up how severe their electrical sensitivity is. We thought, well, maybe electrically sensitive people may have stepped exposures before there's any clinical evidence that didn't necessarily lead to electrosensitivity at that time. And I thought, well, how would they know about it since electromagnetic radiation is, invisible and doesn't have a noise or a color or an odor? And so we thought the time they would be aware is if they had had a severe electrical shock. So we inquired about whether people had had a significant electrical shock, and 25% of the electrosensitive group compared to less than 5% of the control group had that, highly statistically significant. And moreover, the electrical shocks that they reported were not trivial. Two of them actually reported having been struck by lightning. Another one said near fatal DC voltage accident at work. Another one had, as a 12-year-old child, grabbed covered a bare electrical wire going from a refrigerator to a wall and were unable to release until someone unplugged the refrigerator because their hand was in tetany from the exposure. So these people had, in many cases, very significant shock exposures, and that clearly was one factor that distinguished them from the people that did not go on to get electrical sensitivity.
Mhm. Yeah, just to comment, you remind me that in the early 1990s, I was writing about healthy housing, chemically wise. I was invited to Ottawa by the R2000 Home Program. Health Canada was holding a seminar there where the Minister of National Defense, Art Eggleton, who was the former mayor of Toronto, his secretary became very ill with multiple chemical sensitivity. And there was a doctor there called Jerry Ross. You may have heard of Jerry. He was from Nova Scotia, very, very ill. He was treated by Dr. Ray in the Dallas Environmental Health Center. And he said that fibromyalgia, MCS, chronic fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, they should all be regrouped under the vocable environmental illness. And he mentioned also, the diesel exhaust and everything else. It's interesting you mentioned smart meters, very interesting, because as you know, your colleague Lisa Naj, who's a speaker at the EMF conference, she says most of her patients who are EHS, electrohypersensitive, were exposed to mold severely as herself. But your smart meter data, was that published? Or was that the one
Well,
that
as
you?
I said, when we did the survey, it was just before my mother became very, very ill, and then there
Yes.
was a long time period where she was in the hospital, and
Okay.
then a death, and then I sort of spent 2 years in deep grief because both my parents died 2 weeks apart, actually. So we never got around to publishing that. We still should do that. We also did, among the factors that we looked at were chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, and mold sensitivity. All of those were significantly elevated in the electrically sensitive group. The most statistically significant of those actually was mold sensitivity. Um, and as you are probably aware, there are mold, quote, mycotoxins, unquote,
Yeah.
that actually have adverse neurological impact, but also that mold sensitivity reflects, again, impaired ability to defend against the adverse implications of the mold. So this concept of overlap conditions is one we're familiar with. In 2012, I published something like, I think it's called, oxidative stress and mitochondrial impairment in chronic multi-symptom illness, from Gulf War illness to autism spectrum disorder. And that includes the chronic fatigue syndrome and, fibromyalgia and these other conditions in there. and then also extends it to the different time frame, the different developmental time frame of autism spectrum disorder, which people think of as purely cognitive, but there are high rates of many of the other problems like gastrointestinal problems and other neurological problems, and the problems that we see in Gulf War veterans and so forth show up at elevated rates in children with autism spectrum disorder as well. And there's evidence of mitochondrial / bioenergetic impairment in all of these conditions. There was an excellent study by Myhill and McLaren from England that looked at 8 different stages of ATP production in neutrophils in chronic fatigue syndrome patients, and found that you could pretty much completely separate chronic fatigue syndrome from healthy controls based on this impaired energy production. With fibromyalgia, there are now studies also showing mitochondrial impairment, but even before that, there were studies showing that there's reduced capillarity in muscle of patients with fibromyalgia. And I could go through what the mechanism is, but once you have impaired cell energy from mitochondrial impairment, that actually leads to multiple other types of cell energy impairment, including reduced total body blood volume, which has been reported in chronic fatigue syndrome. And then in turn, that can lead to reduced regional blood flow like that's been reported in fibromyalgia. But the blood volume phenomenon tracks together with the mitochondrial impairment phenomenon for reasons that we actually understand.
So
they're not necessarily distinct issues, but they're part and parcel of the same problem.
So it's not only blood flow, but blood volume also?
Yep, total body blood volume. Yep. Wow. And this is probably one reason that women are more vulnerable to almost all of these problems than men. We start out with lower blood volume, even relative to body size, than men do. So we have less energetic reserve. Mm-hmm. It also turns out that women have there are multiple different reasons why, in the case of EMF, we have thinner skulls, and the skull is like the barrier to the brain for EMF, and the brain is the main organ that's affected. The brain is about 2% of the body weight in non-obese individuals and represents probably even less in obese individuals, and it uses about 20 to 25% of the oxygen and 50% of the glucose of the whole body. So it's by far the most energetically demanding organ. So it's particularly hit hard when there's an exposure that hits cell energy. The analogy that you could give there would be, you've got one tree that, you've got a cactus that doesn't do very much, but doesn't require a lot of water. And then you've got a bushy, lush tree that produces a lot of leaves and fruit, but at the expense of a lot of water requirement, like say an avocado tree. If there's a drought, which one is hurt more? It's the cactus may be fine. And similarly, if there's a blood flow impairment, it's the organ that demands a lot of energy that is hurt more, because it's the chasm between the energy demand and the energy supply that determines the level of injury. And in fact, I have even speculated in writing that even more with EHS than others of the conditions we study, it does seem that it's disproportionately smart people that are affected. And some of this may be self-selection for professions that put people early on at higher risk of exposure. Some of it may be that those are the people who make the connection to the problem. But I actually believe that, in fact, I remember early on when I first began looking into this issue, receiving a visit from an electrically sensitive man who was partner at a management consulting firm, and he said he'd spoken with 200 electrically sensitive individuals, and all of them either had advanced degrees or a Mensa level IQ, or I can't remember what his third thing was, or had an Ivy League education, which is certainly not true of all the people that I've spoken with. And there are more ways than one to, adversely have energy supply demand balance. But one way is if you have a brain that has higher function at the expense of higher energy demand, then it's going to be more vulnerable to exposures that impair cell energy supply. So I think it is actually possible that there is a causal, connection between, again, most of the ways of having better brain function require more cell energy, richer connectivity, faster processing speed. All those things impose higher energy demand, and that higher energy demand, like with the drought analogy, can make an individual more vulnerable in the setting of impaired energy supply.
Mm. So you mentioned oxidative stress and mitochondrial injury. It reminds me of this oxidative stress. Magda Havas, the Ontario toxicologist who's very written a lot about EHS, says that she calls it the early or fast how to say aging syndrome, rapid aging syndrome. Uh, so and
Well,
explain.
I don't really know that EHS is rapid aging syndrome, but we certainly in Gulf War veterans who have, again, one of these overlap conditions, we and others have given the analogy to accelerated aging in that case. So there's the mitochondrial theory of aging, which is one of the main theories. There's exponential decline in mitochondrial function with aging. And again, this is accompanied by other factors like impaired cell volume and then consequent loss of cellularity in tissues. We start out with a lot of extra cells in most of our organs, and then many of those organs involve some regenerative capacity, but oftentimes that is finite. So for example, if you lose a muscle cell, it can regenerate, but it will regenerate a finite number of times. Brain cells have very low regenerative capacity, which is another reason why the brain is more vulnerable. And so for the muscle, if you lose cells a bunch of times because you've got some cell energy hit that is killing them off disproportionately, you will start losing muscle mass. And that eventual loss of cellularity is a hallmark that we see with aging. This is why an older person can work out all they want and they will never be able to attain the muscle mass that they attained in younger age. Yeah. Once you run through that regenerative potential for the cells in that organ, you may not be able to get that back. And again, some organs have better regenerative capacity than others. Blood cells tend to be regenerating constantly. Muscle cells are more finite. Brain has, among the least ability to regenerate when cells are actually lost.
At the end of the interview you did with Theodora, you mentioned the analogy of sunburn. I think it's interesting you explain that once again.
Right. And I mentioned that analogy in part because there are still people who try to claim that, oh, look, there have been these provocations. I'm going to step back for a minute and get back to sunburn because there's one other thing I wanted to mention in relation to the concept. Could it be the case that people who have, that were basically killing off the best and the brightest? And I don't mean killing off literally by death, but basically disproportionately disabling the best and the brightest. There actually are data with autism spectrum disorder, which again I view as sort of part of this overlap syndrome phenomenon, showing that the polygenic risk profile in autism, when looked at in non-autistic individuals, is a polygenic profile tied to higher intelligence. So that's another example of evidence potentially favoring that phenomenon. But back to the question of sunburn, there have been so-called provocation studies that say, well, gee, if electrosensitivity is real and people claim that they get symptoms after exposure, then we should be able to expose them in a double-blind setting. They should be able to tell when they're being exposed and when they're not being exposed. Yeah. And that assumes that the body is functioning like a meter, which of course it is not. And if you ask for any other exposure, like a drug adverse effect where people reliably, when they go on a drug, they develop a certain problem. They don't always develop it with the exact same time course from time to time, and we don't demand that they can tell when they're on the drug and when they're not. And with radiofrequency radiation, the time course to symptoms varies within an individual from time to time, within an individual from type of exposure to type or intensity of exposure, and very much across individuals. There'll be some people who have a time course that to me suggests that they're getting, and the profile in terms of both time and symptoms suggests cell death leading to inflammation and brain swelling, with a peak that can occur 1.5 to 2 days after exposure, but with extremely severe symptoms. Whereas there, will be many people who, for some types of exposures at least, will come to be detecting it, in a relatively short time frame after it starts. So these studies take people who purport to be electrically sensitive and put them in a setting where they expose and then unexpose them and expect that somehow they will immediately be able to tell. And this suggests a belief system by the scientists in which the biological effect comes on instantaneously and goes away instantaneously. And that's why I give the analogy of sunburn, which is another, radiation-induced problem that is mediated by oxidative stress, culminates in inflammation that leads ultimately to reddening of the skin. And it provides many of the analogies that I think are relevant to EHS. There are wide differences in vulnerability to sunburn, and in fact, those are based in part on oxidative stress defenses, as we see with EHS. In fact, that melanin that leads to tanning, that is an antioxidant. So your ability to produce that antioxidant that protects against the ultraviolet radiation-induced burning varies substantially from individual to individual, and whether you've already mounted your tanning response. So there's a phenomenon called oxidative preconditioning, where if you're pre-exposed to low levels of an oxidative stressor and like ultraviolet radiation, then your body may upregulate the defenses. Now, if, for example, you have mitochondrial impairment, which leads to ongoing production by the body of oxidative stress, you may not have any ability to further upregulate your antioxidant defenses. You may be already perched at the point where any more oxidative stress is going to tip you over into clinical symptoms. So there are some people there are studies, by the way, looking at brain cancer that say, oh, but with lower intensities, if anything, it's tied to lower risk of brain cancer. And a lot of the investigators that I've spoken to don't believe that. And I say, I think it's absolutely possible that on a group basis, the low intensity non-ionizing radiation leads to this oxidative preconditioning with upregulation of antioxidant defenses. And on a group basis, on average, this may lead to protection. But that doesn't stop the fact that there are individuals who do not have that effect, who already are perched at any maximum ability to upregulate. And at any oxidative stress beyond that is simply depleting and further worsening their antioxidant defenses. So I think both of those things are true. And in fact, if you look at the studies on antioxidant levels, if you look at studies on oxidative stress, like Yakimenko did his analysis where he identified 100 studies that looked at low intensity radiofrequency radiation and whether it produced oxidative stress, and reportedly 93 of the 100 studies found that it did. But if you look at what happens to antioxidant levels, they're all over the map in different studies. In some studies they go up and some they go down. That's just what we should expect. That's consistent with this phenomenon of oxidative preconditioning, where in many individuals with with the right level based on their pre-existing health state and genetics, a low level of oxidative stress will upregulate antioxidants, and in other individuals they will be depleted. So that looks inconsistent, but it's actually completely consistent with a vast literature that is not confined to radiofrequency radiation, but goes across many different substances. So anyway, that's the sort of sunburn analogy. It's a type of radiation. Ultraviolet includes both part of the non-ionizing and ionizing portion of the spectrum. It leads to injury through an oxidative stress mediated phenomenon. It's very well documented that sunburn and photoaging from ultraviolet are mediated by oxidative stress, that people who have impaired antioxidant defenses are more vulnerable, that the time course to the sunburn after people are exposed is going to, if they get it at all, like some people have to have a much longer exposure before they develop the problem. Other people will never develop the problem with any likely exposure level, whereas other people have very low antioxidant defenses at the level of the skin and can develop sunburn with comparatively minor exposure. The time course to symptoms will vary. The time course to recovery will vary. It's not the case that as soon as you withdraw the ultraviolet, the symptoms go away. So the design of these provocation studies is flawed, from the outset. The right way to do such a study would be to have, first off, the other problem with those studies is that you don't really know what else the people have been exposed to before and en route to the facility. So those are issues. you don't really know what other radiation they may be exposed to at the facility besides what's being turned on and off in their vicinity at the time of the study. But if you wanted to design a study, the right way to do it would be to have most of the exposure settings involve no exposure. And the reason for that is there is another phenomenon that we know of um, from chemotherapy, in which people will have a conditioned response to the expectation. This is not the same as psychogenic or suggestibility. It is when the stimulus causes actual severe damage, then people's body will go into the mode. And with chemotherapy, what ends up happening is people, they enter the room where they've had chemotherapy before and they may start throwing up because their body is both trying to warn them about the potential exposure and have an aversive reaction so that they don't expose themselves again. Again, that happens because the actual exposure is actually harmful to that person. So, and that requires multiple non-exposure episodes for, quote, extinction, unquote, of that phenomenon. And that means that if you wanted to design such a study to be effective, you would want most of the exposure times to have no exposure, and then get them used to the idea that they're not responding, and then rarely have a live exposure, and that will let you see that, and make sure you allow it to be long enough and significant enough. And so that's the other problem, is that these are not, for affected individuals, symptoms in this case are a sign of physiological damage. So these are not necessarily entirely benign experiments. It's not necessarily the case that the injury that will occur with an exposure, if you set the exposure level to be one where you're sure they have symptoms, that there will be complete physiological recovery from that. So that's sort of the other, potential problem with this, is people think, oh, it's just symptoms. Well, the symptoms are symptoms because there's a physiological problem, and that physiological problem can lead to damage, and that damage may not always be susceptible to complete repair. As you know, there are many studies now that show that radiofrequency radiation causes DNA injury. There are many that show that it causes impairment in sperm-like number and motility and quality. And talking to people who've had serious problems, for some of them, repeated exposures lead successively to, for example, impaired function of the brain. We also know that oxidative stress enhances vulnerability to autoimmunity, and that's been shown specifically with radiofrequency radiation in animal studies, including to autoimmune conditions in the brain. And this also is a fit with both what we see in Gulf War veterans who have increases in a range of different autoantibodies, and also what was shown in the Belpom study, in which I think it was something like 21 or 23% of electrically sensitive people reportedly had antibodies to omyelin, which is the only autoantibody that was looked at in that setting. But so, exposure is not necessarily benign in people who are vulnerable to it. Oxidative stress modifies, quote, epitopes in a way that makes them more vulnerable to autoimmune attack. It also enhances cell death, apoptosis, and cell death exposes cell contents in a way that makes them more vulnerable to autoimmune attack. So the physiological consequences of exposure are real. They vary greatly from individual to individual, just as, the sort of simplified assumption, the simplified example of sunburn, which is a higher frequency by a good amount. And so it is focused, the wavelength is much shorter. So in principle, it's penetrating less deeply. And so it's primarily acting at the level of the skin. But even there, we know that the effects are not necessarily confined just to the skin, but people can develop melanoma, which courses through the body. And let me ask, this is being recorded? So
preparing our interview, I came across a Mayo Clinic book excerpt mentioning sonic scares, Havana Syndrome. Robert Bartholomew explains how the nocebo played a role.
Yeah, he's the one who keeps trying to claim it's all psychogenic. It's all in your head.
Yeah, so explain that to me. Not everyone is affected by the placebo or nocebo effect, but it doesn't last, right?
Well, not only doesn't last, but it largely doesn't exist. So a lot of if you look at the highest quality studies, how do you tell if there's a placebo effect? So the concept of a placebo effect is that based on suggestibility, this is different from a conditioning effect, by the way, which is an actual physiological response that occurs selectively after a seriously damaging exposure. But the concept of a placebo effect is that basically by suggestibility, people will believe that they have problems. And in the short term, this actually in the very short term, this actually has some both biological rationale, like why should evolution do this, and some support. And so, for example, throughout much of history, a lot of insects carried both bacterial illnesses and toxins. And so if somebody says, oh, there are ants or spiders, around, then you may start itching. And that's because your sensory gain is increased to the point where it will have a higher rate of false positives leading you to itch. And that's evolutionarily adaptive to have that occur in the short term. But then if after a while there aren't any insects, you don't keep having that greater, gain on your sensory input. And there is one other way in which that can operate, which is if people are, scared about something, and this may, have potential to be a bit of an issue with electrosensitivity. If people have had past bad experiences and are afraid of them, then the catecholamine release and the sort of fear and stress response actually itself leads to enhanced cell energy demand, and for various reasons can contribute to reduced cell energy supply. And so that can modestly increase some symptoms in people who already have impaired cell energy, et cetera, especially. And so for those things can happen in the short term, but they don't cause chronic effects. And what is the basis for this? So there have been, longstanding claims, placebo effects are large and they occur for everything, and they occur for objective markers and they occur for subjective markers. And if you look, for example, at the, Jupiter trial of statins, looking at the effects on inflammation drops markedly in the placebo group, as drops even more in the statin group, but it drops on the placebo group. And so people think this is suggestibility, and there were a lot of reasons why this never made sense to me in the way that it was articulated. For one thing, with something like HSCRP at the time that was originally being looked at in patients, now everybody's heard of it, but at that time very few people had. And you might as well have said it in German. Like, how is it that people know to make their body affect that one chemical when they don't even know what the chemical is? And it's not the case that everything is affected. It's the case that that is affected. And these claims that, there's about a 30% placebo response rate, for everything, no matter what the experiment. Okay, so if I drop a house on 30 people, are you telling me that, placebo responses are going to keep some of them alive? I mean, just the way it was characterized made zero sense. So how do you actually look at how good is the evidence for a placebo response? So in a, quote, randomized trial, the purpose of randomization is to protect against systematic differences between the treatment groups. So, for example, the treatment group and the placebo group. So to see if there's a placebo effect of suggestibility, what you really want is you want to have a randomized placebo group together with potentially your randomized active treatment group, and a randomized no treatment group where they don't think they're getting placebo. So do people do any better on placebo than on no treatment? And the answer is this was analyzed by Hobjortsen et al. From the Nordic Cochrane Center, and they looked at all the studies they could find that included both a randomized placebo group and a randomized no treatment group. And to first approximation, there pretty much is no placebo effect. There may be a very tiny one that they said could just be due to bias for a few things that are subjective, but largely the placebo effect goes away almost entirely. So that what really is going on there is regression to the mean. People enter a study when they're doing worse on something because it picks people that are at the worst end of that, and then maybe some of those get better, maybe some other people got worse, but you didn't include them in your study. So you don't see that other group that got worse. You're only seeing the people that were picked for being at the high end, who on average are going to get better over time. So that's what placebo effects really are. And then if you look historically, even when the sort of concept of, oh, the mind can create all these illnesses was really popularized by Sigmund Freud, and even in his writings, it's clear that this is substantially a mythology. And there's a case where he was treating a girl who, I think, depending on the account, was either 12 or 13 years old for, quote, noisy hysteria centered on abdominal complaints. And he claimed he cured her, and then she died of her abdominal sarcoma. Mm. And he said, oh, yeah, too bad. It's really, there were two problems, and I fixed the one. Too bad I missed that other one. But he never admitted that this had been wrong. But this is kind of what we see again and again. There was a case of that was, I remember, I don't know, 5-6 years ago in California, a woman had presented to the emergency room several times, reporting, vague symptoms that people couldn't find evidence for in any of the objective tests they happened to do. And again, like not every health condition happens to affect routine laboratory markers. And so they decided that, so the concept psychogenic typically means that your belief system creates the symptoms. And then this is often kind of melded with the concept of malingering, which is where people are intentionally creating symptoms for some kind of secondary gain. And the two terms are not used very distinctly if you look in the literature. They're basically both ways of blaming the patient for their problem. And in this case, apparently they thought that the woman was malingering until she required a ventilator for respiratory support. And finally, her hantavirus infection was diagnosed. And then we heard a few months later that she died. So people are blown off if they have symptoms that somebody else cannot do testing that identifies the basis of. And this has happened again and again. In our surveys of Gulf War veterans, this is one of the biggest sources of anguish that veterans had, is they were told their problems were all psychogenic. Now we have colossal amounts of evidence showing objective biological markers, but they're not routinely assessed biological markers. Many, many biological things are grossly awry in affected Gulf War veterans, but not routine biological markers. I remember one of the veterans saying, it's just like what happened with my mother, who was told that her going blind and walking into walls was all in her head, and then she died of the grapefruit-sized tumor in her brain. So this is like, and I will say that if you look at the literature, a lot of things used to be thought to be psychogenic until the underlying actual cause was eventually identified. People used to think ulcers were all due to stress, and then it turned out that over 95% of the time, they're attributable to either Helicobacter pylori or nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And the other 5% of the time, those don't have to be psychogenic either. It's just not one of those two particular things. And then, you look at the things like the NADA receptor antibody disorder, which is a fascinating condition. There's a wonderful book by a journalist who developed that problem called Brain on Fire that describes her experience developing a range of brain problems, and the lucky chance that ultimately she ended up with a neurologist that did a brain biopsy and diagnosed that she had this NMDA antibody disorder, and then she was treated and apparently cured. But that condition creates a lot of very bizarre symptoms, a lot of which are similar to the Linda Blair actress portrayed in The Exorcist, where people can seem like they're talking in tongues or crab walking backward or doing a lot of very strange things because of these antibodies to the NMDA receptor in the brain. So when people see strange things, they've often said they're psychogenic. When people see common things, so all roads for the people who want to declare something psychogenic lead to psychogenic. If it's rare, then it's called bizarre, and then it's psychogenic. If it's common, then it's called nonspecific, and then it's psychogenic, which I think is hilarious, because really nonspecific symptoms like headache and insomnia and a lot of the symptoms that people get with electrosensitivity, what really nonspecific means is that there are many, many, many different physiological problems that will cause the same symptom. And so therefore it's not physiological, when many different, whether it's a drug or a cancer or infection, they can all cause cognitive problems. They can all cause fatigue. They can all cause headache. They can all cause, and yet then when people have these quote nonspecific problems, they're psychogenic. even though they're not specific because a million different actual physiological things will cause them. So even the sort of reasoning that goes behind this is ridiculous. But what has really perpetuated it is, frankly, the fact that now many times these problems arise in settings, say maybe there's an exposure to school and a lot of people get sick. And then people say, oh, look, it's mostly women and children, it must be psychogenic. Or maybe they'll bring in somebody to do chemical testing, and chemical testing is almost never testing of everything. And it certainly is never testing of everything in concert. We don't have data on what the safe levels are of things in combination with other things. And either the levels will be said to be all be safe, and they'll usually be well after the time that people were having the problems, or they'll say, oh, there was a little bit, but it couldn't have really explained that. And then they'll say, oh, it's mostly women and children, so it's got to all be in their heads. And again, women and children have many reasons why they're more vulnerable. They have higher surface area to volume. For the case of EHS, they have thinner brains. They have lower blood volume, which means they have less energetic reserve. And also, it turns out that a number of detoxification systems in the body are actually androgen dependent. This includes something called UDP glucuronidases. It includes NADH and NADPH oxidases. It includes, I think, the pi family of glutathione peroxidases, and I think there's one other family of that I'm blocking on right now. But so a number of these detoxification systems that are used to reduce injury following environmental exposures actually are activated by androgens, and us women have less of them than our androgens. So those detoxification systems may also be less avid. So that's, these are among the factors that contribute to why women have higher rates of chemical sensitivity, chronic fatigue, electrosensitivity, many of these different problems. And it's not because those problems are psychogenic. It's because we're weaker physically, muscularly, we have different body composition, and a number of those factors, a number of those biological differences. Again, these are statistical differences. Plenty of men get these problems as well, but they do make women more vulnerable to a number of chemical and environmental exposures.
I think it's really inhuman also to talk about the nocebo effect, because most of the people who get sick from electricity, they never knew about the dangers of electromagnetic fields.
Yes, and in our survey study, we asked about that. We asked people, when you first developed symptoms that you now, recognize to be from electromagnetic radiation, were you aware that other people had these symptoms? And I think it was over 70% said no. And in fact, some of them said, I had heard other people who claimed it and I thought they were nuts, until I experienced it myself. And then when you made the connection, were you aware? And it was still most people, no. Yeah. Most of the people had never heard of it when they developed these problems and did not know that other people were experiencing these problems.
By the way, I'd love to see your smart meter data. What percentage of how many people said that it was the main trigger?
It was 200 people that were electrically sensitive in this study, and 69% acknowledged having had a triggering, inciting exposure. And of those, I really remember seeing the bar graph where overwhelmingly the number one thing was smart meters, and way, way, way down at way less than half the height of the smart meter graph was the second one, which actually I think was a combination of several different exposures. So it wasn't even a discrete second one. And then, for some people it would be, a few people cell towers, a few people cell phones, a few people medical exposures. Sometimes it will actually be a drug exposure that will trigger people into both chemical and electrical sensitivity. We did find in our survey study, one of the issues that we're interested in is toxicity from a class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones that also cause mitochondrial and oxidative toxicity, and a subgroup of people lead to chronic, multi-symptom, persistent progressive health problems. And we did find that both that use of fluoroquinolones was higher in the electrically sensitive group, and that the fraction of people who had used a fluoroquinolone who developed an adverse effect was, I believe, 50% in the electrically sensitive group, compared to vanishingly small in the control group. So this also suggests that at the time they took their fluoroquinolone, they already had greater mitochondrial vulnerability. So the fluoroquinolone is both probably enhancing the mitochondrial vulnerability, and the adverse effect that occurred in 50% of them on the fluoroquinolone was probably advanced. But it's basically both reflecting and contributing to the mitochondrial problem.
Okay, we're about to run out of time, so I want to get back to the Havana Syndrome. You have a slide in your EMF conference presentation where you mentioned the Glenser diplomat and a measurement of 1 milliwatt per square centimeter, and I converted that. It's actually 10 million microwatts per square meters. So obviously these diplomats and spies who are voluntarily being bombarded by the Chinese, the Russians, and what have you, the levels of exposure are huge. You don't see that in homes or schools.
Yeah, I don't want to comment because I haven't measured what people see in homes and schools. I understand that sometimes it's a lot higher than allowable limits, so I can't exactly comment on that. But what I can say is I know that speaking to one of the Chinese diplomats that was affected, both it was the case that it was already known, like one of his neighbors had already purchased a tri-field meter, and this was after I think my work began being circulated at the State Department. I had written a letter to the top doctor of the State Department in January of 2017, 2018. I can't remember now. I guess it must have been 2018, like expressing why, with many citations about why I thought this was the issue. But I think around April was when we began hearing about problems in China. And one of the neighbors had actually purchased a commercial off-the-shelf tri-field XE meter and shown that the levels of radiofrequency radiation were off the top of the meter. They had previously dismissed her problems and said it was because she was premenopausal, and when her mother flew out to help her mother got sick, and it was because she was postmenopausal. And then when the readings came in, they went and backed them out within a day. But then when the neighbor, catty corner, one down and one over, began reporting health problems instead of telling him that he was in a building that was having this high exposure, this is all according to him, they sent him to see the State Department psychiatrist. So you can draw your own inferences from that. And these are all, like, I don't have clearances, and I don't want clearances, because clearances mean you can't, say what you see. But based on those reports, and that has, he's put that in official documentation, those issues of trying to, like, again, there's a benefit to claiming that psychogenic things exist, because that's what allows, in many cases, industry that may have a culpable product to evade culpability.
Tell me a bit about the Frey effect, because people are still saying it's a sonic weapon, but it's not necessarily.
It's not a sonic weapon. And, people have added, like, oh, but it could be sonic, because if you make your sonic thing really, 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 really carefully, that it can have this effect and this effect, but it does not have all of the effects. So it was my paper, and I briefed the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, sharing the evidence. Their report that was published in December 2020 agreed with my conclusion, but it was my work that laid out the evidence showing that it had to be pulsed radiofrequency radiation. And the basis of the evidence was threefold. The one circumstantial piece, which is that, people had in an embassy, U.S., foreign services personnel in an embassy setting had been exposed to this kind of radiation in the past and had reportedly experienced symptoms. That's the weakest of the pieces. But then the other pieces are that the quantitative profile of the symptoms is a match to the quantitative profile of symptoms reported with radiofrequency radiation, and a quantitative match to nothing else that is known. So, for example, if you compare the diplomat reports of symptoms to the report from the Cato Johansson paper of electrosensitive people in 2012, so before the diplomat paper, so not influenced by the diplomat paper, headache 81%, 81%. Cognitive problems, 81%, 81%. Sleep problems, 86%, 76%. Dizziness, 67%, 64%. Anxiety, 52%, 56%. Very close quantitative concordance. And pretty much anything that causes mitochondrial impairment and oxidative stress can cause all of those symptoms, but everyone has its own profile because everyone has other stuff going on. Like the high rate of auditory symptoms is relatively specific to radio frequency radiation because it's operating primarily through the brain and there's no skull barrier at the point of the ear. So we see all those symptoms with Gulf War illness, but they're not in exactly the same ratio. And in Gulf War illness, you'll see much more muscle symptoms, for example. And then the other thing that compelled this conclusion, in my opinion, was the characteristics, as you say, of the Frey effect, the sounds that people reported. First off, different people heard different sounds. Why would that be the case if it were a sonic source? Why not have one thing that, made one sound heard by all? And we know that for the Frey effect, even if it's the same pulse radio frequency exposure, different people hear different sounds because the sound perceived depends on both. It only occurs within a defined frequency range, but it's not based on the frequency. It's based on pulse characteristics and head dimensions. So head dimensions differ and cause different sounds. The second factor is what were the character of the reported sounds. They were things like chirping and buzzing and hissing and knocking and clanging and clicking. That's just the spectrum that you hear with the Frey effect. Why, if it were a sonic source, why would it be those sounds? Third off, it was reported that these sounds were heard essentially exclusively at night. Well, that could happen because maybe people only are exposing people at night, but it would be expected to happen with radio frequency radiation because the Frey effect is only perceived in settings of low ambient noise. So if it were not the case that it were reported essentially exclusively at night or in other settings of very low ambient noise, then that would exclude the Frey effect. Fourth, people reported that there was tight temporal localization, and early news reports said that this defied known physics. Well, it may defy physics of sound, but it does not defy physics of electromagnetic radiation. In fact, they said it was laser-like localization. Well, lasers are electromagnetic radiation. Of course, they can be tightly localized. And people reported that they would, move, a couple feet away, the sound would abruptly stop. They would move back, the sound would abruptly come back. That's completely compatible with electromagnetic radiation. It's hard to achieve with sound. You'd have to do all kinds of special shenanigans to try to make that happen. There's no reason, like by Occam's razor, like why would you be introducing the concept that we, did all kinds of shenanigans to create this thing by sound, and as we'll see, doesn't fit everything anyway. And then the next thing was that people would report that in the territory in which the sound was heard, it seemed to follow them when they moved. Now, for sound, we have what's called the superior olivary nuclei in the brain that help us to localize sound based on the timing difference of the sound wave from one ear to the other. And so we're pretty good at localizing sound, and a sound source doesn't seem to follow us when we move. But multiple people reported that the sound source seemed to follow them when they move. Well, that happens with the Frey effect naturally because the sound is produced inside the head. It is typically perceived as coming from just behind the head, or for some people just above the head, and for some people inside the head in the back. But for that person, it's in a fixed location, irrespective of their orientation relative to the source of the sound, and for that reason, it seems to follow them when they move. So that, again, is inconsistent with the sound source, unless mysteriously you're having some way of having the sound source follow them when they move. Again, like highly unlikely. And then finally, it was reported that some people covered their ears or covered their head, and this did not attenuate the sound. Well, if it were sound waves, it would attenuate the sound. And in fact, with electromagnetic radiation, not only would not attenuate the sound, but it could even enhance it. And when people do experimental studies of radiofrequency radiation to produce the Frey effect, or they will actually cover the ears or use noise blocking headphones to magnify the intensity of the sound. So for those 6 reasons, those factors together, in my opinion, 100% compel the conclusion that it is not an energy weapon that could be sound or electromagnetic. It must be electromagnetic radiation. And there are some people I know, because I was invited to be in a government commission, which I won't talk about, because then they afterwards said that we were supposed to keep who was in it quiet, and then afterward disbanded it, where it was clear from the outset that the intent of the commission was to come to the conclusion that it could be electromagnetic or sound. And some of the people in that group were clearly they wanted it to say it could equally be sound because their funding would benefit from that. So I think there's like a push by some people to say, yes, it could be sound because that's what they study and they want more money to roll to them. But the sound hypothesis does not make any sense based on those factors.
I'm showing here Mark Polymeropoulos, who was the equivalent of a general, so decorated as an American spy that people did take him seriously. After I'm told there were about 1,500 reports of spies and diplomats saying they had these symptoms. And why was he taken seriously? And how was he treated from after that act, the Havana Act?
You'd have to talk to him about how he was treated. I remember he was quoted, maybe it was in a Gentleman's Quarterly or one of these magazines, as saying that he would rather have been shot. And one of the reasons he would rather have been shot is that people believe you when you've been shot. And even though, as you say, ultimately people believed him, and part of that is the personality that is willing to speak up on your own behalf, which understandably a lot of people don't have. That reflects the fact that he also had challenges in getting people to believe his experience.
Yeah. Well, if you have any way of contacting him, I'd appreciate if you put us in touch.
Yeah, I did email him and pass your information, so it's up to his determination.
Okay, great. I just noticed the Atlantic, January 10th, the consensus on Havana Syndrome is cracking. It's not obvious with the Trump government.
Well, there was never a consensus because there were always parties that wanted to claim that it was psychosomatic. And the attention that was given to Bartholomew's work, for example, Scientific American published something by him. I suggested they publish something by me, and basically they said no. So, as is typically the case with this kind of thing, there are parties with a stake in what the eventual belief system will be. And in this case, there's a multi-trillion-dollar industry that doesn't want attention brought to this issue because, and in particular, for example, my paper wasn't even cited by the National Academy's report, even though I briefed them and they came to my conclusion. When I asked the chair of that committee afterward, it took me a few months to calm down. Why didn't they cite my work? And basically the ultimate answer was they didn't want to look like they got it from one source. And since mine was the source that came to the same conclusion, they didn't cite it. But I think really probably the real reason is they don't want to bring attention to things that show, as my paper inherently did, by looking at the quantitative profile of symptoms, that similar problems can arise with commercial sources of electromagnetic radiation.
Well, Beatrice, it was really a pleasure speaking to you. I'm going to refer people again to the Environmental Health Trust website, where you also granted an interview. And also, perhaps they should be aware of the importance of measuring in their homes and businesses and schools and hospitals. I'm showing here the Safe and Sound Pro 2 with the building biology guidelines to avoid chronic effects from long-term chronic.
Yeah, and I think the Safe and Sound Pro 2 is great for radio frequency radiation, but people also are affected by things like magnetic fields, which may require another meter. There are some excellent building biologists out there that can help people to assess their home environment and mitigate exposure. It is apparently particularly important to mitigate it at night. There are studies showing that for some people, exposure depresses melatonin. People think of melatonin as for sleep, but melatonin actually is one of the most critical mitochondrial protective antioxidants in the body. And this may be another reason why some people become affected more than other people. There may be, again, it may be both reflecting existing, state and then influencing that existing state, that people may have drops in this, just like we said before, that for many antioxidants, it'll go up in some people and down in others. And it more likely will go down in people whose antioxidant systems they don't have further ability to upregulate, and then they'll simply be depleted, and maybe that's what's going on there. But especially protecting from radio frequency radiation and other electromagnetic radiation during sleep is apparently particularly important for healing and recovery.
Yes, the SLT Safe Living Technologies.co website. They also have different shielding paints and fabrics and the low
Yep,
level and high level meters.
yep, yep, yep. They're a very good company. Yep.
Mm. Well, thank you very much for sharing. I will send you the link and let's keep in touch.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Here, bye bye.